I would think at this point you've been so patient listening to all that it's time to open it to the floor and to your questions. Eric.
Yes, thank you so much. I would say I loved all your talks, so I asked this question with a genuine sense of curiosity. So the United States narrates its origins as a nation of refugees even, or it still continues to be a nation of refugees. And, you know, the settler colonial project, settler colonial societies are a territorial project, okay? And as the late Patrick Wolf tells us, okay, that it operates by the logic of elimination, which, like extermination, images its object beyond the border of the frontier. So my questions, as I wrote them down so it's easy. When does the enlightenment of a borderless world subtly reinforce the logic of indigenous elimination, where indigenous claim to territory remains, as Jody Bird puts it, lamentable but not grievable? And secondly, does the sovereign and political integrity of indigenous nations become surpassed by compelling critique of borders?
Thank you. Should we collect several questions? Would you, yeah? And,
that's a good idea.
okay,
Can I?
please.
Yeah, this is MP Prabhakaran, an alumnus of the New School. You have very ably articulated all the problems, and I hear from the horse's mouth during my travels around the world, which is what I've been doing lately, and I also write about many problems that I heard from these people who suffered. And to shamelessly plug in my latest book, its title is An Indian Goes Around the World, What I Learned from My 30-Day European Odyssey. It was released last week. I have to shamelessly promote myself, sorry. So, especially what I heard from Dr. Anderson, I can relate to what I recently heard. Greeks, you narrate the problem, but the origin, the actual reason you're not gone into. When I see college graduates selling underwear on the roadside in Greece, it is heartbreaking. 40% of those people are unemployed, exactly. Most of them educated. And this catastrophe that we're witnessing in Europe, it is caused mainly by the policy followed by the great, illustrious president who is now well ensconced in his ranch in Texas, enjoying his hobby of chopping woods and mountain biking. So I wish you had mentioned that. And is there any way we can
get to your question?
Can take more responsibility for this catastrophe, because they are doing what they can, but the biggest culprit is here, and we are the least affected by the problem in Europe, at least. One of you could articulate that.
I'll take one more question, please. And yes.
Hi, my name is Trina, and I am interested in disability studies, actually, and I was so glad to hear you, Juanita, say that we assume that eugenics is kind of long gone, or that it ended after World War II. In disability studies, we look at how it's actually very much present and alive, and sometimes it's called newgenics in that way. I just wanted to offer, Rena Rapp at NYU works at the intersection of disability and eugenics, and there's an article that she published in a book called Flexible Eugenics, where she actually mentioned, and this kind of ties in all of us women right here, how in the early 90s, when the Human Genome Project was emerging, she went to an LPA conference, Little People of America Association, and she saw someone with a T-shirt that said endangered species. As a kind of, an LPA, Little People of America Association, doesn't identify as a political organization. They're really a support for families and lots of other kinds of neoliberal stuff. But this T-shirt kind of calls attention to the, well, I won't analyze it, but it's pretty impactful, endangered species. That was in the early 90s. Of course, now what's naturalized is a kind of, you know. So my question is, how do you think we could engage more with disability? I'm noticing there's a lot of non-human, human talk when a lot of what's happening, even in terms of citizenship changing, even within the United States, in kind of like neoliberal policies, moving us from citizens to citizen consumers, I'm wondering if there are ways to understand the other by understanding how even within there's othering.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. I would like to.
Shall I start?
Please,
Start, we'll
Bridget.
go this way.
Okay, so maybe taking them backwards. I was thinking when you were talking about that slogan, Save the Human, from Amnesty International, which has always intrigued me about, well, so what's that about? And I'm actually really interested in questions of disability and migration, because it seems to me that there's very little actually about it, and that migration tends to assume an able-bodied person. And also there's very little has been analysed about the relation between the able-bodiedness, if that's the right word, of citizenship and of the concept of citizenship. So the kind of the ways in which citizenship is gendered and raced and classed have been kind of unpacked a bit, but actually very little about able-bodiedness. So I think that's a really important question. I'm not sure how to kind of link it to the invasive other than to say that, you know, I also think that the idea of, so what I was trying to say about the relation between the citizen other inside the nation, who is largely the non-worker, you know, the unemployed or the inactive in some way, I think is, and making that connection maybe between, was it Eugene who was talking about cancer?
Yes.
So, you know, maybe the question of cancer as well as invasion is kind of useful to think with. And just on that note, sort of maybe taking a little bit of advantage of something that you said that made me think.
So.
We haven't talked about GM, and I was just thinking, I wonder how GM kind of fits
Interesting.
I'm gonna
Yeah.
say
in
something
this
about that in a
in
second.
this conversation. Good. That's
Good.
so. I think that's just a sort of series of random thoughts, really, but a beginning of a conversation. I think it's for the second questioner. I think that it's really important in Europe to bring together these two crises: the crisis of austerity and the crisis of migration. I would say those aren't actually what the crises are, but that actually it is important to think about both of them and to think also about where they're located historically, which is, of course, to do with the kinds of wars and the situations we've seen in the recent past, but which is also to do with ongoing histories of colonialism and the Euro-Africa project, actually. So I think that we need to think about both those. And again, I was struck in the when I was listening to the other speakers about the importance of time and temporality and where we situate ourselves kind of temporally, which I think has both kind of interesting, both political, immediate policy, but also kind of theoretical implications, which kind of gets to the question about the indigenous. And I suppose I'm uncomfortable about the labelling that there has been of migrants as the next wave of settler colonists. I suppose because I think that those categories, both the idea of the indigenous and the idea of the migrant, are ultimately colonial categories, which is not to say that there is not which is not to say that don't support the struggles of indigenous peoples for their rights and for their rights to belong as much as their rights to move. I mean, many of the people who are crossing the borders are also indigenous. You know, so it's not like it's a different struggle, but I think we have to find ways of looking at the two together that kind of escape the idea of natural rootedness in a specific territory. But again, I think that's the beginning of a conversation.
Thank you.
I'll pick up where you left and just say that in general, and this addresses the first question, but I'll come back to it. If there was an implicit critique in what I was trying to say here, it's precisely to get at this question of the way in which the notion of the stability of landscapes and the kind of idea of ecology, and the way that's linked to the sense that there are original landscapes and there are migrations and there are natives as against indigenes, and that conservation is a good thing because it restores some kind of natural equilibrium. We've gone through this when we think about visions of society, and we try to move beyond functionalism in that regard and the organic analogy. And it seems to me that this is one of the key things, is to listen to some of the critical ecologists who actually raise questions about these sorts of issues and say there is no such thing as this idea of an alien species that's threatening the way that it is. This is a kind of metaphor all the way down, right? Because there's this wonderful book by a man called, I think it's Thompson, called Where Do Camels Belong? Which shows that, in fact, camels come from Latin America to where they migrate, even creatures of that size. And the notion that there is any kind, that the whole kind of notion even of the naturalized ecologies of balance and threat and homeostasis and so on is where we have to begin. And I think it's not only that we're dealing with models of colonialism, although I think that is very much the case, but we're also dealing with models of the liberal modern nation state, right? And the problem that lurks behind all of this is that borderless worlds still require some notion of community, some idea of, if you like, the inclusive political framework, and I'm using political here in a more, if you like, positive sense, constructive sense. Communities against which rights and claims can be made and shares can be reckoned, right? So that between the borderless world and the notion of the xenophobic nation or the colonizer, we need some idea of political community, and it doesn't necessarily need to be one of limited humanism, right? But there needs to be some idea of how we deal with scarcity, how we deal with the fact that we live in a world where the very idea of production and work on which modern ideas of human dignity rest is in many ways passé. And we have to think again about a post-proletarian world and the way that is linked to notions of citizenship, employment, value, gender, all of those things, right? So it seems to me that that's one of the ways in which we have to begin. I don't think we can simply do away with the borders, and indeed categories of human change all the time. But after all, modes of producing value are always about the interaction between different sorts of species. And it seems to me we can't skirt that question, ultimately, of what sort of political communities. There's a worldwide community of a sort, but we know that global human rights are the least enforceable. They have great rhetorical power, but making them count in any way is exceedingly difficult. And that seems to me what lies between the two poles of the notion of opening the borders and the kind of xenophobic reaction that one sees, which comes from, and your point absolutely, people who in fact have no modes of livelihood or production, and no way of knowing where they can even find or make a claim. And under those circumstances, what contains, where do rights lie? You have to have some kind of sense of enforcement and containment. And that move towards trying to draw the line between you and the next desperate person, which is a highly relativizing thing, right, is part of what we're seeing here, it seems to me. So however one wants to think about those communities, clearly the old idea of the nation under siege, the nation state, is not adequate. But how do we relativize entitlement, inclusion, the rights to mobility, the kind of uneven distribution of resources? Those are the kind of topographical problems, it seems to me, of politics that lie behind a lot of this. In relation to the question you raised about disability, this is a fascinating question because in many ways it goes to the same kind of point. In places like South Africa, you have a kind of, we're in post-totalitarian states, we are now rebuilding a world of inclusiveness. And you have many constitutions that exquisitely detail the rights of the disabled. Yeah. But in fact, more as rhetorical exercises, as if the naming and the stating of those rights makes them real and makes them happen. Under conditions of extreme certainty, all those distinctions are reduced to a simple line, who's in and who's out. Yeah? And part of what was terrifying about the sorts of things we saw in South Africa was that it was an effort to reduce all of this numinous promise to some kind of certainty. Arjuna Padurais used the word dead certainty about ethnic violence as a way of trying to say, okay, the buck stops here, and this is where it's going to happen. But what you said, I think, about the question of the linking of this to genomics is extremely interesting too. Because, and this leads me back to this question of eugenics. There's some amazing work being done recently on the new kind of moves towards consumer genomics, of which California is one of the centers. Yeah? And again, you see inscribed in this work an amazing sense of race, of whiteness, of finding your ancestry, of choosing your sperm donor, and back inscribed in all of this, under the guise of very kind of humanizing, sort of opening up our abilities to edit the gene and to improve our species and so on, is exactly this sort of thing. So it's not going anywhere. It's right there. And it seems to me, again, this is one of those questions. I just end by saying I think all of the critique is very, very important. That is, it's not enough, but to expose constantly, because these things are constantly naturalizing themselves. And the idea that, okay, now we've done with genomics, and here comes this new kind of lab technology for the perfection of in the hands of us all. And here yet again, the same kind of logic.
Is it tiny? And
It is tiny.
yes.
I just wanted to offer, there was a study that was published somewhere where there was a group of...
I don't think you can hear you.
Leonard Davis is another disability studies scholar who looks at, there's a community of little women in South Africa who actually cannot get a certain kind of breast cancer. And the fascinating thing about that is that at the time, and this is like the early 90s, doctors didn't even know that a certain kind of breast cancer was linked to a growth hormone. He's using that argument as a way that if we get rid of all of the differences, all the things that, if we think, and I heard cockroaches are actually brilliant. So if we get rid of all of these things, then we don't know what, the value of diversity and difference really is. So I just wanted to bring us to lift there.
Extraordinary example.
Yeah.
Extraordinary example.
All right, I just have a couple of brief comments. Is this mic on? Yeah. No. All right, thanks. Thank you. Yes. All right. Well, I live in British Columbia, which is where, which is a place where Indigenous movements are very, very active, and which is a place where most of us, where all of us do our work on primarily unceded territory that was never ceded to the British Crown. So we inhabit that space of unceded territory, and we begin all events by acknowledging that we are unceded territory. And as we began today, I realized that I had not investigated this particular place and its sort of territorial history in terms of indigeneity. But I just wanted to add to the conversation that I think Indigenous forms of conceptualizations of nation and sovereignty in many cases do not coincide with sort of colonial or nation state ideas of nation and sovereignty, but rather are different, involve very different kinds of conceptions of what those terms mean. And so I know that many of us react very quickly to the use of the idea of nation by Indigenous peoples. But I think if we actually read a lot of indigenous work, we might have different ideas about the way that is being deployed and utilized. For example, Audra Simpson's book about the politics of refusal, right? And I also just wanted to add, of course, that in many indigenous communities, a part of being part of a community involves very different kinds of relationships with non-human beings, right? So we talk a lot about the politics of decolonizing in British Columbia, and it's not something that's, you know, sort of in the abstract. It's like right in your face every single day as we inhabit unceded territory. So I didn't really have anything much more to add to that, but I think it's important issue for all of us. And I just also wanted to say, in terms of disability studies, I wanted to say that Sarah Jaquette Ray has written a book about the idea of nature and wilderness and disability, and it's really good. And it's very important. I don't know how much work beyond that is being done in the sort of the relationship between conservation in the eugenic sense, right? Nature conservation and disability, but I know that her work is very good on that. And also because I got so excited about the talks before mine, I forgot to say that I was so happy to be at the New School because I did a master's degree here and I took a class with Raina Rapp. So yeah, anyway. And I also wanted to say that you probably know, I think it's Matthew Chu's work on, but he argues that the first efforts to classify native and non-native species were drawn from late 18th century British common law determining rights. So I think it's interesting the way the civic law was kind of mapped onto the species, kind of the law, what would we call it, the classificatory systems that were being developed. And in terms of human rights, that you were mentioning, you know, the ways that they cannot be employed. I mean, I think the issue there is that they were constituted in relation to a particular imaginary of the human, right? And they're inherently anthropocentric, so there's always space for the outside, which is and for those that can be cast out and cast into the realm of the non-human.
I wanted to just add one thing, if I may. I've been working for the last, this semester, but also for the last 10 years on the politics of sentiment, and thinking a lot about affect and race. And one of the things that's come up here that we haven't really discussed is this constant kind of metaphoric push towards beautification, towards cleanliness, towards those who produce waste and therefore become products of waste but are themselves waste. Zygmunt Bauman has made this point beautifully. But there's a history that I thought might be very interesting for you, that I've been working with a critical legal theorist very closely the last year, Patricia Williams. And there's a book called The Ugly Laws. I don't know how many people know about the Ugly Laws, but the Ugly Laws were really stridently enforced in the US in the 19th century. And the most bizarre part about them is that they could never really define what was ugly. But ugly was disability, right? In some form, it was the not enabled worker. It was poverty. Right? It was those who were of diminished capacity. It was lice. It was those who were infested with those kind of vermin that should not be, and it reminds me so much of South Africa under apartheid. It's not only that they should not be there, they should not be seen. And the Ugly Laws were to keep those people off the streets, and to keep those kinds of things from being seen, which was exactly, of course, what we see in Palestine and Israel with the entire way in which the expressways have been carved out so that Israelis don't have to see Palestinians. And in South Africa, whites didn't have to see anybody who lived anywhere else. You could get to work without. But this notion of the Ugly Laws as being something that is actually made into law, but is much, much broader metaphorically, that there are all kinds of instantiations of the ugly laws throughout the world that I think we really have to attend to.
Hyper-policing right here. Yeah, I mean, the idea that the way in which you now create safe space from what is seen to be vagrant, which again
Right.
is similar, unmotivated, non-utilitarian, unworking movement.
Well, the
is
super
very much about
predator as well.
Precisely that kind of thing, right? Yeah, and it's linked also to ideas of utility. I
Right.
think that's the other key thing, that came up so clearly.
Yeah.
The idea of the useful, not only in terms of the viable labor, and the fact that in South Africa there were factories where you took these jacarandas that were these wild and turned them into useful objects. But to come back to your point too, the whole way in which even Nazi, genocide turned the body of, the Jew, as it were, an uncontrolled capital, an unnationalized being, into utilitarian objects. Right? So that process too, and the domestic of all of this.
Yeah, I mean,
Please, and then we'll move forward. Oh, Bridget,
just want to
please.
just say two things. One is about beautification. That actually I was very struck when Juanita was talking about waste. That's been now something that's being really pushed in Europe. Is basically you can follow where the migrants have been because
By
you
the waste
follow
they
the
leave
trails of
behind.
waste.
Well, this is Juanita's been at the forefront of this
Yeah.
for a long time.
So you could really see those. I thought that was you could really
Yeah.
see that. But the other, I agree absolutely with what you said about the importance of thinking about the nation state and how we can form political communities. But another thing that I think we have to really think about how we even begin to dismantle is possessive individualism.
Oh, yeah.
And that's such a difficult thing to think with and divest ourselves from. But I think it links maybe also your conversations with Juanita's in a way.
Yes, and of course the very problem with rights. I mean, there are elements of rights which are about precisely that,
Yeah.
and notions of heritage and rootedness that are precisely that, and that's the difficulty.
I'd like to open it if I may. Yes, please. Oh, okay.
Thank you so much for your really interesting talks. My name is Anna. I'm a master's student in environmental policy here at the New School. And I have a question about shifting baselines. So I think when you say the other, there's always the implication that there was a natural baseline.
Yes, exactly.
And so you're all shaking, saying yeah. So I'm not going to go on and on. I just think I would love to hear from all of you about that. I think it's a really interesting idea.
Thank you. Please. Right.
Hi, my name's Leslie, and I'm a geography student. So, so my question, I'm sort of obsessed with agency, and I know, and I'm always looking for resistance everywhere. And I know Juanita has dealt with that a little bit, and you sort of referred to it a little bit, Bridget, at the end of your piece, maybe in talking about the commons. So I'm just interested in your comments about where we can find agency in this, and then maybe just putting out there your thoughts or whether or not you've engaged with thinking about the ways in which people and things that have been characterized as invasive may embrace that invasiveness. And I'm particularly thinking from queer ecologies and sort of embracing the abnormal in a Foucauldian sense. So I'm just open to your comments on that.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Radhika. I was actually following on something that Anne just said, which is the idea of things that are visible, and I'm kind of relating that to this notion of beautification, as well as the idea of feeling the swarms of people are arriving on your shores. And I was actually interested in things that we imagine that are not actually visible to us, partly thinking about disease and vectors and the imagination of invasion that is sort of microscopic, that seems, because, with Zika, with Ebola, the worries that we have or the fears are manifest entirely around things that are completely invisible. And so I guess I was wondering about things that we can no longer see as boatloads of people, but that we imagine are still sort of miasmatically entering our shores, and whether you had some thoughts on that.
Okay, sorry. Thank you for such fabulous papers. They're really beautiful and nuanced and speak wonderfully to each other. I just wanted to take up Juanita's challenge about speciesism again and see if you guys could speak more to it, because you're all showing the ways in which, you're all showing the ways in which these species boundaries are being leaped, as Jane said, and thinking about Mbeki's discourse from plants to people. And yet you're also using it as a new political grammar, I think the way Bridget is, when thinking about grafts, right? You know, putting together things that don't necessarily, you know, we don't always imagine together. So I'm wondering about the possibilities of challenging species as a way to think about new grammars, but also thinking about the dangers, as we're just talking about, and as the next panel will address, of course, are the pathogens and zoonoses, which skip species boundaries in ways that become threatening, right? So you have it as both possibility and as threat, and I'm wondering if you could speak to that tension and where you might take discussions about new political grammars that you've opened so nicely.
Did you want to add your, yet? Please. Thank you.
Going back to the crisis in Europe, it is complicated, and nationalism and parochialism taken as plea.
This was a footnote, you said, very short footnote.
Yeah. Let me recollect. Because of the terrorism, you know, and British Prime Minister, Italian Prime Minister, Greek Prime Minister, and the German chancellor, they are not less compassionate than we are, but they have this worry of terrorists sneaking in the guise of refugees, and there concrete evidence also for that. Somebody getting on board with a laptop, whoever thought that laptop will carry bomb, and it is happening.
Thank you.
So their worries
Thank
are
you.
very real.
Would you like to address?
One more.
We had one more. We had three. Okay, we can try one more.
No, I have the mic.
Please.
Sorry. Thank you, Aisha, and I had some questions to direct to
Thank you.
Bridget Anderson. And in your book, you talk about classlessness, and maybe you could talk about that here, because when we talk about migrants, there's a big debate, like in Germany, about them creating wealth, being part of the sustainable development in the countries where they are moving to, irrespective of where they've left. And so I want you to talk about this in relation to class, race, and gender, and then maybe you could go more into why is it always about wealth creation, and this can also feed into this question on disability. Thank you.
So, let us try again.
Can I not start this time?
Would you like to start, Juanita?
You start.
Okay. Oh, yes. Thanks, everyone, for these comments and questions and the discussion that's happening. I think it's really exciting. Yes, I wanted to say something about the question on agency in relation to undocumented migrants that walk through these landscapes that I've been talking about. And one of the things that one of the ways in which I think people may embrace or at least are comforted by their status as outsiders on that journey, I'm just talking about on the journey, is in relation to the trail of so-called trash, right? Because the trails that people follow are dotted with personal belongings that have been lost or things that have been discarded. And so when you're, but also along the trails are shrines, religious shrines, that people seem to know about because they carry and leave those big glass candles and light them. So, I mean, you know, you wouldn't carry one of those things on a 5-day journey because they're not that light unless you knew that you were going to leave it somewhere, right? So along the route are all kinds of signs of a landscape of people, right? walking. And I did a lot of volunteer work with No More Deaths in the course of doing my research, because it helped me a lot to learn and about the issues. And one of the things that even I sort of became gained a sense of comfort as we walked trails, right? By seeing things on the trails, not comfort in the sense that because I knew that people were in danger, but because it demonstrated, right, that sort of trajectory. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the things that I've thought about in terms of how people kind of get a sense of comfort as they go along, or a sense of belonging, like we're on this trajectory together, right?
Sort of a claim.
Mm-hmm. And that's, I've also thought that, yeah. I mean, I haven't done interviews on it, but it's something that I've thought a lot about. Yeah, a sort of a claim to a landscape, right? Because there's all kinds of things that they also make out of trees. Like, they sort of weave things together to make tents, and yeah, there's many different things that I've tried to show through photography, not my own. That the ways that those kinds of claims are made in the landscape, and their presence, right, is made evident in that landscape. I don't think I'll say anything else just yet.
Thank you.
Okay, let me try and link a few things. The question of the baseline, and you know, it's a very important question, and that's precisely the kind of critique that these alternative eco-naturalists are claiming, like, for instance, this book, Where Do Camels Belong? And that links up to other questions about whether one claims the role of the alien, and your very important question also about labor and work, right, and the class of migrants. Because it seems to me that one of the key arguments that has been made by these critical ecologists is that, in fact, alien plants are often, if you're even going to see them now, trace them as if you could track their recent maybe crossing of borders, is that they're often extremely useful. that they and in fact that they survive in climates where which are themselves changing, and where indigenous species, so-called, are often not doing so well, shows that there are kind of relative survival qualities there of strength and usefulness and redefinition and so on. So in that kind of context, the question of what is an alien and what isn't, the degree to which the interloper from outside might be something that would be exceedingly useful, and in fact changes the whole kind of complexion of a landscape itself. And this is where it became so interesting to me to find that what in the late 20th century was being termed a dangerous invasive in the South African context was very different from what 50 years before had been claimed, and that had to do with changes in agricultural production and the whole way in which the economy operated and so on. So that aspect, and the fact that much of the critical discourse about immigrants makes the point that, in fact, they often are about job creation, that they're about new kinds of mobile forms of producing value that are not dependent on old structures of class, and they're problematical often because, in fact, they don't fit into older categories of working versus non-working people, of bourgeoisie versus the underclasses, that they themselves, in fact, bring new kinds of skills that are opportunistic in the useful sense, right? And that gets to this question of species and speciation that you raise, Miriam, which is a really interesting one. And I think this is something that goes back all the way to something like, Susan Sontag's illness as metaphor. When, in fact, can we contain the kind of metastasization of metaphors? And when, in fact, do they cut useful ice? And that's always a value judgment question, right? There comes a point where the isolation of a particular kind of category of disease, for instance, has to be named, at the same time as one wants to realize that it's always being transcended and that it always is available for metaphorization, that we can never kind of check fully. We can't police speech, but one has to be aware as much as one can, and this is where the critical work on the languages being used can alert general population. A lot of this is done in the media very well, I think, in the critical media. But the question of when you use and how you use, and the fact that we all have to opt for certain kind of closures, otherwise we wouldn't be able to speak anything, right? But at the same time, the way in which species, and indeed lots of the kind of wonderful rhetorics of landscape making and as a creative process involve the idea of the blending of species, or the, but at the same time, the degree to which it has been used as a naturalization of race becomes a huge question that we have to be constantly aware of. And as we police other forms of speech, it's the way in which naturalization seems to creep in without, that ostensibly that's beyond politics, but the language of politics is always shifting. And that seems to be where the work of criticism is never done, I think is the point, And that's where, in fact, the cultural and symbolic logics of these things, which gets to the question of agency too, of course. Where does one attribute agency? A good deal of the interesting work on the entanglement of a kind of Latourian sort, right, is suggesting that we have to think much more broadly about the agency that is not anthropocentric. But at the same time, that also seems to me can lead often to a kind of promiscuous romanticism, or else the kind of pessimism that you see in the Anthropocene literature, where the agency has gone crazy, and ultimately we're all involved, locked in a process of decline and destruction, and we have to learn how to die gracefully, death in the Anthropocene, that kind of vision. And that seems to me to be also problematical. We all prioritize agency to some degree. And the question is, for what purposes, for what political motives, for what kind of gains? And how does one have a sense of non-human agency that's also principled and learns from a materialism and a geography and environmentalism that looks at the fact that material things have consequences, but not randomly either. We have to look at them in terms of the politics of shifting balances of resources and scarcity and so on.
Yeah, thanks. I was thinking, I was reading a paper the other day, I can't remember who it was by, but it was about a Nazi landscape designer who was kind of very popular in the 1940s, and how they were kind of, basically they had to get rid of rhododendrons as being an invasive species. So they had a kind of list of the plants that needed to be pulled out of good German gardens.
England also is getting rid of them, huh? In the National Trust properties, rhododendrons.
Yeah, rhododendrons are actually really bad news.
Yeah. Beautiful, but deadly.
But then I was thinking, this is really interesting because they didn't pull out potatoes. There's an invasive species that somehow everyone's learned to tolerate. So I suppose that's, in terms of the natural baseline thing, and I was thinking too how, I was thinking about science fiction versus religion, or science fiction and religion, and the idea of the Garden of Eve, the idea of the Garden of Eden and the serpent in the Garden of Eden as almost like the ultimate invasive species, and how far back some of this goes. I'm conscious of the fact that nobody's answered the point about the visible and the tiny, and I'm not quite sure what to say, but I think it's really interesting, especially, I suppose, partly because of my interest now in thinking about GM and the fear of, the GM, that basically all this stuff is going to spread out of the ways in which it's policed, and how and kind of how what we say speaks to some of that, and whether there's some forms of, and I suppose what I think is perhaps interesting is that there's some forms of invasion and invasive species and denaturalization that are okay, that are basically state endorsed and that we don't have to challenge, in contrast to the forms that maybe we do. So thinking about kind of legitimacy in that way. Perhaps that gets to terrorism. And I suppose what I would say is, borders do not keep out, so policing borders actually, I think, effectively work to create more anxiety and more rage and anger than actually keeping out so-called terrorists who are, after all, made, not born. And that also, thinking about the about class. So I'm really struck by basically what we have in Europe now, I think, is really the kind of return to quite an old model, which I thought we'd finished with, which is basically the refugee versus the economic migrant, and the two, and basically you need to sort out which of them, which is which, and we can do that by nationality, so it seems. So, and of course we welcome refugees, but economic migrants are much more of a problem. And then to counter that, you have the, they're kind of creative and they kind of do all the jobs that Europeans don't want to do, and and they're much more hardworking, and you can sort of start hearing people sound really like a lot of the employers that I've interviewed about how Brits or French or Greeks are actually lazy, unlike migrants who've got a much better culture. So it kind of quickly becomes that. So I think, I'm always worried when people start talking about how productive migrants are as a reason why they should be allowed to come. Because I think precisely it reinscribes the idea of the worker citizen that we were talking about. And I think, and I think that's something that we really have to deal with, because the worker citizen, so the idea, the virtue of the worker is something that you get from left and right, and actually it's got a long history. You think about, it wasn't just Locke, it was also Winstanley who said, we have to value the labour of the labourer. But actually the problem is there's not enough work to go around now, and that's become a problem. Rather than that being a kind of liberation, it's actually become a problem, because people are valued in this very kind of very centuries-long way through the value of what is perceived to be their contribution, which is a certain type of productive, not reproductive, labour. And that's something that, again, I think, if we're opening up the conversation, I think that some of what Juanita was talking about was really making me think about how this is about gender and reproduction, and how that kind of figures in these conversations.
It certainly does. I don't think we really have time for any more questions, but we have another day and a half of incredible talks that we can return to some of these subjects. But I would like to end on one note, thanking everyone, the three of you, for such amazing both conversations and the ways in which you've engaged with these issues. And I'd like to put on the table and remember, and I think you brought it up very well with disability studies, that this metaphor and the space of invasion actually is not about that which is external geographically. It's about what's external to the norm of a kind of normative way of being. It includes, in the universal adversary, one of the major scenarios is, quote unquote, the disgruntled worker. And I was thinking of your intervention and how important it was. It wasn't anybody from outside. It's the disgruntled worker, which is facing an entire history of labor unionism, of rights, of protest, the right to protest. The disgruntled worker becomes this kind of unique internal enemy within the social fabric, which otherwise is abiding by the norm. And it's the same for the super predator, the young black man who knows no remorse, who can never know remorse, and therefore should be subject to the death penalty. So I'm concerned that we get so caught up in the invasiveness that the invasion actually is very much inside this very space. Thank you all for amazing talks.